Okay, let's go ahead and just get started. So greetings, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world these days. So my name is Kyle King. I'm the Managing Director of Capacity Building International, and just wanted to welcome you to our next webinar in our 2021 webinar series about NATO's role in crisis management. And we're very happy to host this webinar today, along with our colleagues from the Crisis Management Disaster Response Center of Excellence. And they'll be presenting to us today. But first, before we get to that, it's a very full webinar today. So I just wanted to cover a very few quick points with you today before we just get started. And first of all, I'd love to know where you're from and where you're joining us from, because, and just let us know in the chat. Go ahead and just drop in the chat where you're from, because our record so far in our previous webinars, even though we just started this webinar series between CBI and the International Emergency Management Society, is 23 nations. So if we can beat 23 nations today, that would be fantastic. That's our current record. As we get through the webinar itself, if you do have any questions, which you very may well, go ahead and put them into the Q&A feature, and we will go ahead and write those down. And Victoria from CBI is with us today in the background. She's helping us kind of capture all of those questions and to get those noted. If we don't get a chance to answer your questions today during this webinar session, we'll certainly be able to post them later on in our LinkedIn event and get your answers then. Now for today, so again, my name is Kyle King. I'm the Managing Director of CBI, and joined here, of course, by Harold Drager, the President of the International Emergency Management Society. And of course, our guest speakers today are Dr. Eric Benson from CBI, who is our Academic Director, Dr. Manlio Silvestri, Brigadier General from the Italian Army and retired, and our International Advisor at CBI, and then of course, Colonel Dimitrov from the NATO Crisis Management Disaster Response, COE, and they will do their introductions in just a second. But what I wanted to do really quick, of course, is just turn the floor over to Harold in case you have any opening remarks. Harold, over to you.
Thank you, Kyle. Yeah, I look very much forward for this presentation today. As president of teams, we deal with emergency management all around the world, and I know NATO has good systems and we can learn a lot, and I look forward for this as an opening to closer cooperation. So I look very much forward for this. Thank you.
So what we'll do is, as we go through this, and I wanted to remind people that in order to keep track of this event and what's going on, because it is an entire series throughout 2021, and we're going to have a number of speakers presenting during this series, what we did was we created a LinkedIn event, and you can actually just follow that LinkedIn event. And we did that for a couple of reasons. One, so that we could have actually everybody kind of following this and interact. You can post documents, links, and everything else like that. If you do have additional questions, again, not able to answer today, you can actually ask that inside the LinkedIn event itself, and we'll be able to answer those as well about the seminar and the series. What's nice about this, though, is that you're able to get a notification in LinkedIn when we do post something new, especially such as when the new events are coming, the new webinars, and you can register then. The challenge that we had with an entire series for a year is that we can't really confirm the dates and the speakers so far in advance, for like August and September. So we use this as a mechanism to keep people aware and build a little community around this event as we move through the year. Now, go ahead and, if you're not part of that already, just go ahead and head over to LinkedIn and you'll find that event and under the LinkedIn page for Capacity Building International, and you can join the 146 other people that are already following this event online as well. Now, speaking about the additional webinars we're going to be having, this is just a glimpse into the presentations that we have already organized thus far and that are coming up pretty soon. And so we're going to do about 2 webinars per month, and that's going to be starting with nations presenting their models and their disaster response models from France, China, Finland, Czech Republic, Australia, India, United Kingdom, and Kosovo, Germany, and Italy, just to name a few, and that will continue as we move through the year, and that will develop even further. If you are interested in presenting a brief overview of your national system or know someone working at a national authority who would be interested in presenting, please feel free to contact us, and we will certainly set up a call and make the arrangements to do so. This is something that we are continually evolving and moving through, and in some of these cases, you'll find that, of course, time zones are an issue. So as you can see here, very simply, we are covering a lot of different nations and time zones. And so some of our webinars may not be at the same time as they are today. And we might actually go and of course, when we have Australia present, we'll have to do it on their time zone and based on the speaker's availability. But certainly register for the webinar and the event, because you'll be able to get a recording, and we send those out 24 hours after the event has concluded. So just keep that in mind. And as we move through this kind of webinar series, but I imagine it'll be, and I do believe it'll be very interesting, especially when we hear from different models and national authorities that we typically don't really hear from. And that was one of the great benefits of partnering with the International Emergency Management Society today and throughout this entire webinar series. Okay, so at this point, that's all for me as an introduction, and I will just like to turn it over to Eric Benson. But before I do that, I actually just remembered, before I do that, Eric, before we start with you, if you don't mind, I would like to just throw up a really quick poll, because we had a question come up recently that I thought would be very interesting. We had a number of speakers who wanted to come to provide a COVID prevention or going from a response to a recovery kind of COVID themed seminar. And the question was really about, should we go ahead and just start discussing how we're going to recover our societies and rebuild our societies after the pandemic? And so the question that I have for you today is that something you'd be interested in? Because the idea that we have is to develop a short mini series is what I'm calling it, a mini series of a webinar that will be, say, 3 to 4 sessions. And then we would talk about recovery options and what different nations are doing to recover after the pandemic. So I'll just give that another few seconds just for you to go ahead and drop in your opinion on the poll there. And I'd love to just get your response with that. When we do organize that, that'll be a separate track from our 2021 webinar series. And we'll just do a kind of a side track and a themed response or a themed session there, 3 to 4 kind of short series to be able to dive a little bit deeper into this. And we'll go with that. Okay, so that was a fairly overwhelming response for the number of people that were responding. And so it looks like about 86% favor that. So that's something good, Harold, that we can make note of, and we'll certainly take a look at that and talk back with our colleagues and get something arranged. Thanks for sharing that and your opinion. And now I will hand it over to Eric. Eric, over to you.
Thank you, Kyle. I appreciate that. And I'll go ahead and pick up sharing, which I should be able to do. And I want to thank you all for joining us and for your patience. As a lot of times we're doing these things, of course, it's always challenging and passing it along. But I'm very happy to be sharing some time today with my colleagues in presenting to you about NATO and emergency management. Now, I'll do a little poll of my own. This will be unscientific, nothing too systematic. But just to start is we're going to talk about NATO's role in emergency management. I just want to ask you all, when I say NATO, or when you hear the word NATO, what do you think of? Just take a moment. I'll say from my background as somebody who grew up in the very last years of the Cold War, I was pretty young, but it was remarkably formative for me. I recall basically, if you were to say NATO, I was thinking of, well, that's the military alliance designed to prevent, Russian tanks from rolling into Germany and starting World War III. Now, for those of you that are younger, that might seem the stuff of video games, but frankly, that was a real possibility back in the day. And so so much of that for me has been, I would say, formative. And I think for a lot of folks my age, maybe a little younger, maybe a little older, who would say, again, that NATO is very much a concrete military alliance. Typically, you would not think of NATO as being involved in emergency management. It's probably something that would not occur to you right away. And yet, as you begin to dig into this subject, you begin to look at it. NATO has had a very vibrant presence in emergency management. The picture I just brought up is of a NATO aircraft that is delivering COVID relief supplies. So NATO is providing logistical support, transportation, even in the midst of the COVID crisis. Now, my colleague, Manlio Silvestri, authored a blog we just posted to our website here about 3 or 4 weeks ago, where he talks about how the concept of collective security has underpinned NATO's existence. And yet that has evolved. What that looks like has evolved from its start all the way through to the present, how that's expressed from really a mutual defense pact in the Cold War to now looking at out-of-area operations, projecting stability, that sort of thing. And so as we look at that, it's very important to understand that as NATO has evolved, its role has evolved, and that's also evolved with regard to emergency management. The thing too to keep in mind is that emergency management has evolved throughout this period. In a sense, emergency management and NATO, which spent around 70 years, have matured pretty much side by side. You know, emergency management as we see it today really has come out of developments in the last 50, 60, 70 years. But they're not just moving in tandem, they're actually very much intertwined. There's a definite connection here between NATO and emergency management. And frankly, it goes all the way back to the beginning. And of course, as a historian, that's my background. I always like a little history. I like to understand why things are the way they are. How did we get here? And so kind of a quick snapshot history for you all to talk about this connection and what we can see in this story. At the beginning, of course, of the Cold War, in the years immediately following World War II, you have a rather quick escalation in tension between former wartime allies. The Soviets, frankly, are not trusting their Western allies, the United States, Britain, and so on, and the feeling is mutual. And this leads to a series of events that, you know, manifest itself in a number of ways. Probably one of the most important is events in Berlin in 1948-49, which become known as the Berlin blockade, and the responding operation, which is called the Berlin airlift. Very simply, Joseph Stalin decided to cut off supplies going into the western sectors of Berlin, which of course the Soviets had surrounded because of the partition of Germany at the time. And what that means is he can cut off food, fuel, et cetera. And he's doing this to leverage the Western allies. He basically wants to, well, to hold sway, to dictate how things are going to be done, not just in Berlin or even in Germany, but really he wants to ensure that he has a, we would often say, a preponderance of power in Europe. So all that to say, this presents the Western allies with a bit of a problem. You don't want the people of Berlin to starve to death. On the other hand, you don't want to give way to Stalin, but you know, how do you do this without prompting a conflict or a war? And this is where they developed the famous Berlin airlift. So this is where, as you look at it, in fact, I'm going to move this over because I've got images. Well, that actually might get in the way of wording, so I might be shifting this a little bit. You have the famous airlift where they fly in supplies. Now, frankly, when they're doing this, people are not expecting it to work. Surprisingly, it works well. And this ends up being really a case of where Joseph Stalin not only miscalculated about the effect of the blockade, but he made the bigger miscalculation in that this led the Western allies to pull together and found NATO, which of course is premised in this idea of collective security and resisting possible Soviet encroachment. But if we look at this a little closer, what's often missed, and I would say this as a historian who studied this, we often miss how this airlift is really sort of a crisis management operation. The crisis, the humanitarian crisis, is the potential starvation of West Berlin. And to respond to that, they arranged this operation to meet the crisis. So from its very beginning, NATO is rooted in emergency management and emergency management response. And so, you know, this collective security, et cetera, this goes hand in glove. Of course, in 1962, we have the height of the Cold War with the Cuban Missile Crisis. What's often missed, and what very few people, an event very few people know of, is one that took place the following year when an earthquake strikes Skopje in what is today North Macedonia, at the time Yugoslavia. And this is a very devastating event. I've got that picture there off to the side, as you can see, where it had led to over 1,000 deaths. You had tens of thousands of families left homeless. It was a very devastating earthquake. What was interesting was this prompted a remarkable humanitarian response. Nations from around the world sent help, including from both East and West. Now, NATO was not involved in this directly, but a lot of NATO partners sent assistance. In fact, that picture is of a US medical team going in to provide assistance in medical care. Now, Part of this response, though, we have to put in context. Of course, there's the Cold War context. Yugoslavia at the time is headed by a guy named Tito, who's very adept at playing East and West against each other. So in a sense, both sides are sending in help because they see it as a way to, if not advance their interests, at least safeguard them. If Tito's not going to be in our camp, we want to keep him out of the other camp. So again, you've got these security interests at work, but you've also got a sense in which how those are being manifest is a little different. Here, it's about sending in, again, what we would call emergency management. Now this is very rudimentary. At the time, and again, as my colleague Manlio has noted in his blog, or touches on at least a little bit, if you're looking at this, this is really coming out of civil defense more than anything. That's really the initial interest here. So a lot of the modern structures and operations we would see today aren't yet in place, but it's again sort of these seeds of emergency management in that response. So anyway, the end, of course, of the Cold War comes in late 80s, early 90s, and this is the fall of the Soviet Union, of course, Berlin Wall, et cetera. But it also brought about the collapse of Yugoslavia, which triggers the events in the Balkans in the 1990s, a series of course, ethnic conflicts. Now, that prompts a response from NATO to end up, in some cases, actually sending in forces on the ground, as was the case in Kosovo at the time. Now, again, as we look at this, we see, but even from the 60s to the 90s, a remarkable evolution here, both for NATO, but also for emergency management. NATO, of course, in the wake of the fall of the Soviet Union, had to face, well, what are we here for now? What's our role? And as, again, Manlio has touched upon in his blog, this is where we get discussion about out-of-area operations and projecting stability and so on. And again, that explains a number of NATO actions in the Balkans regions in the 1990s. But also emergency management had matured during this time, and we can see this at national levels. In the United States, since the 1960s, you've had the founding of today what we know as FEMA, to provide a nationally organized response in times of crisis and emergencies. This had been before this very ad hoc, very local, very regional, and now you're seeing a much more coherent, professional, national approach to it. And so both NATO and emergency management have evolved to this point, and we're seeing much more what we would recognize today as modern emergency management, and of course NATO's expanded role. Now we can actually see a very tangible connection of this when in 1998 the Euro-Atlantic Disaster Response Coordination Center is established, and in effect this becomes a connection for NATO to civilian needs. The Coordination Center fields requests from nations for assistance and in turn coordinates the response from member states to provide the necessary logistical assistance. And again, this is in response to a variety of emergencies, man-made, natural, and so on. And so we're seeing a very close connection and maturation at this time, by this time. And of course, that has continued to grow through the 21st century. The role has expanded from natural disasters to a number of other things. So some key points here, and I'll close on this and pass along to Manlio. First of all, clearly, NATO and emergency management have a history. Their history has been intertwined together with each other as both the organization and the field of emergency management have, in a sense, matured and grown into what we see today. We can see that the security and humanitarian interests have often intersected. Now, in ways that, of course, can be very complex and can change depending on, context and developments. Cold War versus post-Cold War developments in the field in terms of professional standards and organizations, that sort of thing. And NATO's role in emergency management certainly has grown. It's grown in scope, it's grown in maturity, it's grown in scale. And this is why today, again, we're seeing things such as NATO aircraft being used to provide relief supplies in the case of COVID. And it's involved in a number of other things. For example, the EADRCC has coordinated requests and resources for combating forest fires. And again, we can just see a number of ways in which they're involved in what are clearly emergency management, or what is termed in NATO as CMDR. And again, the fact that we have the center, and I've got the seal up there in the corner, that is clearly front and center as we have the Center of Excellence, which studies best practices. So with that, I'll go ahead and close my portion of that. I hope that little history gives you some idea of what this looks like, where we're at, why we're there. And I'll go ahead and pass this on to Manlio.
Thanks, Eric. Actually, let's hand it over to Colonel Dimitrov from the COE. Colonel, if you don't mind just giving us a quick introduction as well before you get started.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Carl, and thank you, Eric, for the broad historical perspective of NATO, and especially making a very good connection between emergency management and NATO's role all over the world, and especially in the area of interests. So thank you very much once again, and I would like just to continue the Eric's words about the intersection between NATO primary role preventing and preserving the security within the area of interest, but to the humanitarian aspects, especially when it comes to humanitarian situation or involving of especially military assets in disaster relief and humanitarian operations as well. And this is very difficult nowadays to distinguish those two roles of NATO, because you know that the contemporary crisis and contemporary armed conflicts just they draw after all this consequence, but the most the worst one is the humanitarian aspect of the consequences. And no matter it is about the armed conflict we are talking about, or disaster occur somewhere in the area of interest, NATO is already involved, despite that in some cases its role is not so visible, and that is normal, and that is obvious. So I will start with, that's why I divided my talk in that direction. I will start with the NATO crisis response, which is the most vital part of alliance, and what is that role when it comes to disaster relief and humanitarian assistance in terms of engagement. So I will start with the NATO crisis response system, because NATO crisis approach is we can comprise in three dimensions: prevention, management, and resolutions. And from that perspective, developing a kind agile, flexible, and quite responsive system is vital for any kind of crisis management organizations. And when we talk about NATO, we have used a range of responses steps. As I said, and Eric already mentioned, that it is not about only the armed conflicts. It is not about the terrorist attack. It is not about only of thermals or internal insurgent operations. It is about humanitarian aspect of all crisis resolution aspects, because in all the cases, the civilian population is the vulnerable population. It is the population, it is the main vulnerable and targeted aspect of the crisis and the humanitarian aspects. So developing of crisis response system is quite a difficult process. It requires a lot of resources. It requires a lot of stakeholders to be involved in that. And the most important for NATO, from NATO perspective, it requires consensus of all participating member states. But in a nutshell, such kind of system is being elaborated, is being developed by NATO as an integrated system. Why it is integrated is because it integrates from the most beneficial part process, NATO crisis response process, and supported by the number of components. Here they are shown 5-1, and of course some complementary procedures and mechanisms in order to drive that system in a best way. So I mentioned already it's flexible because the flexibility comes from the process, and I will display this process in a few seconds. And what is the main purpose of the system is to provide required preparedness and support for crisis and conflict prevention. And this is the most vital part here. It is not about only just reaction when some happen. And you will see and exactly that system is designed for that purpose. So on the next slide, I will continue with the process. It is a 6 phases process. And if you take a look at the first phase, you will see that we start with indications as warning, meaning that we are focusing on the threats and risks emerging right now, and assessing, analyzing the situation, and in case of there are some indicators that probably a crisis can emerge, we are already in a situation that we have analysis, we have assessment, we have indications and warning system already activated in order to be prepared for additional steps. The next one is the assessment of the situation based on that results gained from the indications and all these indicators that we are monitoring constantly. And we assess whether this requires involvement in NATO in full with full capabilities, and whether it is require deploying military assets or any other assets, or probably we can deploy additional measures different from the military assets and forces, and in order to prevent emerging the crisis or developing of crisis that will require NATO intervention. So based on that assessment, of course, we should develop a kind of course of action, or this is the response options development that, as I mentioned already, it not necessary to be military. It could be economical, it could be political, it could be diplomatical, but in any case, we should react if the assessment shows that we are not able just to cover or to mitigate with any kind of additional means this emerging situation or emerging crisis. That's why assessment and response options development, we call it political military estimate process, because this is the most vital decision-making process done on strategic, political strategic level. And you see on the slide the main committees involved in that process, but the most important decision-making body here is North Atlantic Council, because it has the final word about response options development and taking any kind of measures and taking any kind of actions in case of need in order to mitigate the emerging situation. If the situation requires actively involvement of NATO, we start, of course, planning of operations. It could be military operation, it could be humanitarian operation. It depends on the particular crisis, but in any case, that planning process requires authorization by the main decision-making body. It is once again North Atlantic Council. Of course, that could be not, hopefully not happen, but in some cases, situation requires just to be executed the operations plans, and we move to the next phase, execution. And after finishing with the operation, assessing again the achieved results and the achieved strategic goals. And if we have achieved the strategic goals, and we have at least indicators for stabilization of the situation, we can move to the transition, the last phase of the process. So what I would like here to mention is it is not clear distinct between all these phases. We can conduct concurrently indications and warning, and if it is fast emerging crisis, we move and we split and this assessment and response also development functional, but they are conducted concurrently. And normally within NATO framework, we have developed in advance plans. It could be standard defense plans, it could be contingency plans, and that plans we took the most appropriate one in order to be improved and to be adapted to the situation, and in order to be executable if needs. So this is in a nutshell about the NATO crisis response options, NATO crisis response process. This is the most important part of the NATO crisis response system. As I mentioned, that we are not, it is not necessary to have involved in the crisis resolution only military aspects. Though it is a political military organization, NATO have a lot of instruments in his hands, and using preventive options as economical, diplomatic and political, and in order to mitigate the threats and to mitigate the risks from the emerging crisis, and in order to not to involve again military assets and military forces. We can implement some crisis response measures that are predefined in advance measures, and that measures are also can combine again. It could combine military and political. It can combine the political and economical, but they are focused on preventing of emerging the crisis and involving of military assets and military forces in that situation. We have also counter surprise and counter ingression. I will not distinguish those two components of the NATO crisis response system, because that, especially from the components, because they are logically connected. And if we manage to cope with the counter surprise, we will not move to the counter ingression. And of course, within the operational aspect of NATO crisis response system, NATO have 4 alert states. It's Alpha, Bravo, Delta, and Charlie and Delta, and they reflect to the level of threat for the emerging from the crisis. So, as I said, those two process and components are complemented by procedures and mechanism. We have crisis management organizations, and I will later on say a few words about EADRCC, not so in the details, but because Eric already mentioned, but we have warming intelligence, we have of course Stratcom, strategic communications, which is nowadays plays a great role, especially in terms of hybrid threats. And of course, operations planning, we can involve fast track and accelerated decision making when the situation requires to move between those 6 steps in a very fast manner. And of course, civil emergency planning, which relates to the civil preparedness in advance and the humanitarian aspects on the other side. On the next slide, we have some mechanism. You see that those 6-phase process is supported by mechanism of North Atlantic Council Initiation Directive in order to move to planning process. First, at the end of the phase for planning of the operation, we have Force Activation Directive in order to deploy the troops and the assets in the area of operation. And of course, the NAC Execution Directive just to justify involvement of the military assets on the ground. That is, in a nutshell, in the NATO crisis response system. Why I started with NATO crisis response system. I said at the beginning that it is no matter it is about the armed conflict, it is no matter terrorist attack or disaster relief operation. In any case, we should deploy NATO crisis response system from the very beginning and to the very end. So on the next, that's why we have comprised the humanitarian aspect and the military aspect of the alliance with the civil preparedness. And when it comes to the civil preparedness, we should mention here NATO civil emergency planning process. And you see that we have specially dedicated planning groups. We have international staff dealing with civil emergency planning. We have rapid reaction teams that should be deployed in the very, very beginning of the when the situation happened, and advisory support team in order to have thorough assessment of the situation and provide thorough analysis on the ground for the rapid reaction teams. It is already mentioned about EADRCC. It is the best. Nowadays, it plays is extremely vital role, especially from COVID pandemic perspective. Though it is not so visible, Eric mentioned that there are a lot of resources provided to the stricken countries. Nowadays, there are a lot of requests to EADRCC for providing airlifts, for providing some medical assets, for providing additional medical units in order to cope with situation to the most affected countries. But when it talks about the military assets deployed into the humanitarian assistance and or disaster relief operations, it is quite sensitive issue. Why? Because you know that nevertheless it is about earthquake, or it is about heavy floods or heavy snowfalls, or forest fires. And when it comes to deploying foreign military assets or military forces on the ground, on the stricken nation, it is always a sensitive issue, because it has not only humanitarian aspect, but it has some political, social, cultural, or religious dimensions as well. So from that perspective, we divided that military assets, using of military assets in these operations as a last resort. And you can see here, it is on the top of the peak. We rely, because of the first responder are the local and national emergency management teams. Next, we can involve international civilian relief organizations, for example, UN, European Union assets. And in case that these assets, and these capabilities are not enough, and we lack of capabilities, special capabilities, and we are not able to cope with that situation. We can ask NATO for foreign military and civil assets deployed on the ground. But once again, it is as a last resort. So this is when it comes to immediate life-saving, for example, search and rescue operations, when it comes to the very specific capabilities needed, for example, engineering units, when it comes to some explosive ordnance devices, demolition, etc., in order to be involved in such kind of, they can be involved in such kind of course, some relief operations for life preserving, delivery of aid, prevent situation to be deteriorated, and of course, some recovery. Of course, it is not mandatory to be deployed, for example, stricken for some units, striker units, I mean, but in most cases they are engineer units, they are airlift units, rotary wing units, medical units, etc. As a last resort, once again, we can use military, foreign military assets and foreign military forces deployed on the ground. And that is in a nutshell about those two dimensions of NATO crisis response system. And when it comes to humanitarian assistance, now I give the floor to Manlio. Manlio, the floor is yours.
Right, thank you very much, Dimitar. Can you hear me now? Yes. Okay, so I take the floor. Kyle. Now, being the last speaker, indeed, you have to work with the leftovers since previous briefers did a tremendous job in providing a very comprehensive set of information of crisis management and disaster response. Well, first of all, apologies for my background. It's my virtual background is I'm not in a NATO HQ now at the moment, but I didn't want to distract you with my real background, which is a cellar full of Chianti, as you can see. So, more serious now on emergency. I try not to repeat everything, but I want to highlight a few things that were already mentioned. The word emergency, I must say that is not very much liked across NATO corridors, and I will clarify and explain why. Emergency means a serious, unexpected, and often dangerous situation requiring immediate action. Now, immediate action is not the issue. NATO is and should always be prepared to intervene in a crisis. So the controversial issue is why we had an emergency. That's a good question. Now, if this was due to a bad planning, a gap in preparedness, NATO cannot accept it. NATO cannot simply accept it. So the organization, as per its foundation, must always be prepared to address any threat affecting its population and its territory. Dr. Benson, Eric has already covered the historical developments, but let me just reiterate that the main reason why NATO was founded in 1949 was indeed the collective defense of its member states through military and political means. So at that time, we could have clearly associated the so-called emergency to the risk of war, an invasion by the Soviet Union into NATO territory. Although in that regard, plans and contingency plans, as well as practical exercises, were prepared and conducted to counter a possible aggression. Therefore, it was not really about coping with an emergency, but rather being prepared to react against any possible invasion and just implement the accurately crafted plans. Since then, many things have changed, of course. So the geopolitical scenario did change. Today, if we want to discuss emergency at NATO, the circumstances and the definition are quite different. So we could debate about NATO crisis management related to any geopolitical challenge that may occur, and Colonel Dimitar from the COE already briefed on the crisis management process, or about NATO involvement in the international assistance related to a natural or human-induced disaster situation, where the NATO procedures and mechanisms could be applied, as Dimitar mentioned. In the first case, NATO has the tools to constantly monitor any outbreaking political crisis. So no surprise, just management of an evolving situation. In the second case, we may still discuss why we were caught by surprise, although this should be referred to the whole society mindset and resilience gaps. But that's another story. Think about climate change, disaster, or building houses on earthquake or flooding grounds, for example. This is not really a NATO responsibility, it's a government responsibility. But beside this personal, picky, and long preamble, and as Eric told us, NATO's involvement in international disaster assistance has a long history. As mentioned, NATO has always placed great emphasis on protection of its population. Faced with the potential threat of war, which might involve nuclear, chemical, biological weapons, the alliance developed different measures, various measures, in the field of civil protection. In that regard, NATO members agreed, as it was mentioned, to establish a disaster assistance scheme, as well as some formal procedures for the coordination of the assistance between member countries in the case of disasters. Now, these procedures became also applicable to partner countries. That's very important to note. And since NATO allies recognize the importance of an enhanced international cooperation in the field of disaster relief, they endorsed a proposal to create, as a support and complement to the United Nations, a Euro-Atlantic disaster response capability and partnership policy, the so-called enhanced practical cooperation in international disaster relief. But we need to recall that a much deeper and more significant involvement in the humanitarian aid activity started only in 1992 at the initiative of the United Nations. And this was through a project concerning the use of military and civil defense assets in disaster relief. And the basic philosophy in the project was that history had provided excellent examples of disaster relief being heavily supported by military forces, as the previous speaker mentioned. Nonetheless, we must be clear on this issue. NATO is not, I repeat, is not a humanitarian organization. NATO is an organization for peace, security, and stability. But NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg recently reminded, when referring to the COVID pandemic, a health crisis can easily lead to a security crisis, which will always remain, in the view of NATO, certainly a concern, a big concern. Hence, NATO involvement and intervention. So addressing the pandemic emergency has been entirely in line with the purposes of peace, security, and stability, and then to use all possible resources, military and politically, to bring relief to victims of disaster, and also to do so in cooperation with the world community, including NATO's cooperation partners across the globe. Now, having said that, and for those looking at NATO as a purely military organization, which is wrong, you should not be surprised to see the synergetic efforts between military allied forces and civil stakeholders in terms of military hospitals deployment, medical equipment transportation via military logistics or civilian air carriers, hospital ships, transport for patients, repatriation of citizens abroad, disinfection of public areas, and at border crossing. Indeed, my friends from the Euro-Atlantic Disaster Response Coordination Center could make a very long list about these activities and the nightmare they produce to them. If you are interested, you may count all NATO actions and COVID assistance related figures just browsing the NATO web portal, which has continuously been updated. Definitely, this is the most effective answer to what the Alliance has been doing in the field of emergency management during the recent pandemic and what we'll continue to do in the future. So let me now briefly address the trends in emergency management within the North Atlantic Alliance, having in mind that in promoting and enhancing its tools to better assist its members and partners to address any type of disaster, the core business for NATO remains the collective defense of its members. This is not contradictory in terms of emergency management capabilities, but let's see how in practical terms. We could have a quick look at NATO vision for 2030 principle, the so-called NATO 2030 program proposal. And indeed, we could easily link all NATO collective defense efforts to emergency management. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg put forward 3 broad goals: to keep NATO strong militarily, to make the alliance stronger politically, and to ensure it adopts a more global approach. Now, how can we relate these goals to emergency management, you may ask? If we refer to the historical examples of disaster relief being provided by military forces, and some of them have been illustrated by Eric Dr. Benson, it seems clear that by investing more on its defense forces and developing a synergy with the civil society and private sector, NATO will increase the resilience of its member states, which in turn will contribute to and boost the overall emergency management capability. Clearly, the military needs also to make sure that they maintain their technological edge. So anything NATO can do on innovation, on understanding the full impact of artificial intelligence, quantum computing, autonomous weapon system for its security, will of course also be about the collective defense in the North Atlantic area and in turn an enhancement of the emergency management capacity. The second point about strengthening the political realm can be seen as an improvement in the link between the civil society and the military structure at the advantage of these synergetic efforts and resilience that I mentioned before. An enhanced political dialogue will also contribute to government's information sharing, which is key in the emergency management field. Think about climate change or other pandemic crises that unfortunately might occur. Last but not least, an improved global role for NATO as an international security organization would certainly expand the cooperation among different countries within and outside the geographical North Atlantic area, and therefore promote better coordination during an emergency intervention among involved countries and international organizations. Again, think about climate, pandemic, the economic balance shift, and other challenges. All these are crisis multiplier. In summary, we have linked the 3 NATO 2030 goals to say strengthening the military, enhancing the political dialogue, and taking a global role to the emergency management capabilities in terms of instruments, tools, the mechanism with its synergy, and the wider cooperation. So a possible global framework to address the future challenges. But I will stop here and leave the floor to the webinar host for any question you might have. I stop sharing this. And back to you, Kyle. Thank you.
Thanks, Manlio. Much appreciated. Today's tough on the technology side for me today with Zoom. I think I've crashed out about 3 times and have to rejoin. So it's going well, as we would say. All right. So I just wanted to kind of go into just a little bit of information about the kind of current events that are going on with COVID-19, the pandemic, and other issues with regards to NATO itself. And one thing that I wanted to kind of give you was some kind of current events. And so we've kind of talked historically across this arc, this timeline about how NATO has developed a response that was born out of kind of this civil defense. aspect and has continued to evolve and grow, and especially as even as Manlio has highlighted, the NATO 2030 aspect. And you'll start to see, even if you're coming from the emergency management community and you're looking at this and trying to put these pieces together, a lot of the conversations I have with the emergency management community, we have a slightly different perspective. But what I would say is, look at this from the perspective of really just international assistance, whether you're getting that from DG ECHO from the European Union, if you're getting it from NATO and the EADRCC, or even from the UN. And this is kind of what NATO is doing in that regards, but also watch for the connections between NATO 2030 initiatives and how things are just slowly evolving to more resilient societies, because resilient societies have a direct impact upon national security. And that's where we start to really see a correlation between the what NATO is working on as far as national security structure and architecture, and building in these capabilities and to strengthen the allies and partners. And we didn't have time today to dive into all these different issues, but it goes down. And if you just go to Google and you look at NATO resilience, you'll come up with these baselines, and you'll see these kind of common fields that are being worked on, from energy security to infrastructure and telecommunications and everything else. So if you're coming from the emergency management field, we're working and we are concerned about very much the same things as that. And so that's just something to keep in mind as we go through all these different conversations. And with that in mind, I want to show a few quick examples of some of the work that NATO has done, especially with the EADRCC and some of the good work that they're doing to support. And so, of course, a lot of it is themed around coronavirus response and the pandemic. So, of course, nations sharing resources coordinated by the EADRCC and their efforts to temper this, to bolster and support the response to the pandemic. So NATO and Latvia support to Ukraine would be an example. And then, of course, coronavirus response, NATO and Slovakia supporting North Macedonia would be another. And if you're coming from the United States, of course, you have to understand that many of these nations are often far smaller than what we have in the United States. And so, of course, they're going to be asking very quickly for international response. And so that's just something to think about in terms of the international assistance and aid that's going out there. So in this case, of course, donations from NATO headquarters in Sarajevo. So the individual NATO elements that are also able to donate and contribute to building partner capacity and increasing stability in their operational areas. Not necessarily traditional functions of NATO when we think about it in traditional terms of defense alliance, but then of course, these are all about building stability and capabilities. And I would also, if you're coming from the EM community as well, take a look at what else NATO has produced. It's going to fall somewhere in the lines of something that you're dealing with. This is what I would argue, because if you even go to the NATO website and you take a look, you'll find checklists for non-binding guidelines for the request, reception, and provision of international assistance in the event of a CBR incident or natural disaster. You'll find these just on the NATO website, where I actually just went and got these to prepare the slides. You'll find things like non-binding guidelines. You'll find information such as all the different requests that are currently out there as far as that goes with the EADRCC. And actually a colleague of ours had just passed on the information of the fact that at this moment, there's 15 open requests for international assistance and 13 pandemic trust fund projects where NATO provides direct support and response to the requests for assistance. So again, there's still a lot of work to be done and a lot of work that NATO is supporting with regards to to the pandemic response in itself. That's not the only one, of course, but that's of course taking a lot of our time these days. And then, of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't say that there's just a lot more to be covered within the CMDR aspect. And this is really where we wanted to bring, in partnership with the CMDR COE, the Center of Excellence based out of Bulgaria, and Colonel Dimitrov and his team there, the course into the United States. And we're doing this through the University of California system. And this is the course that we have that is taught entirely online. And it's actually, like I said, with the University of California, delivered by CBI and in partnership with the NATO CMDR COE. And you actually, by enrolling in this course, it is a professional development course, but you'll actually get 2 certificates, which is different from most other courses. This course, you get your professional development certificate from the University of California, but then also at the same time, you'll get a NATO certificate from the NATO COE. So if you're working towards your AEM or your CEM or your national accreditation from your Office of Emergency Management or your state or national authority, this is a great way to get professional development hours to be able to contribute to that. Now, enrollment is open now in case you want to continue this discussion about NATO and how it supports in terms of crisis management and disaster response. And it, of course, starts on March 26th. So head over to that link and we'll circulate that as well in the LinkedIn events page and other methods as well. And so that is going to be with the University of California. If you have any questions, you can head over to that link and we'll circulate that in case you want to take a look at that. So, and with that, what I'd like to say is if they have any questions, go ahead and give us the questions now so that we can answer them, especially while Colonel Dimitrov is here from NATO, and also Manlio and Eric that are actually instructing in the course at the University of California. And there is one question here. Let's see, the European Union also has structures for monitoring crisis and disasters, as well as for channeling crisis management and disaster support resources from the member states to crisis-stricken areas. Could you comment on how NATO and the EU cooperate on these issues before and during crisis, given that many NATO members are also members of the EU? That's a very good question, actually, because there's always a discussion about resource allocation. Who wants to take that, Manlio or Dimitar? What do you think?
Yeah, well, let me first comment on this because historically, NATO and the EU were, let's say, apart in the past. Every organization was doing their job and not really looking at each other, maybe a bit envious, but you know. Then they started interlocking the organization. Now, indeed, there is a close relationship between NATO and the European Union. I would say, but I believe that my friends in the RDCC can confirm that they constantly are connected with the European Union Crisis Management Center, whatever it's called now. And for any crisis, they can address it together and say, okay, this is, we can deal with this, you can do with that. We have this means, you have these tools, etc., etc. So there is a close cooperation between NATO and EU, more close than in the past, in a sense now. And there is a proposal actually for NATO 2030 to nominate a special representative of the NATO Secretary General to enhance the cooperation between NATO and the EU and look at also those issues. This is in short, let's say, but there are more details, of course, that we could develop on that. Okay,
great, Manlio, thanks a lot. And of course, Wim is in the audience, so of course he tells us that EADRCC and ERCC, the Civil Protection Mechanism, have bi-weekly coordination meetings, and they also share information on a more frequent basis as well. So thanks, Wim, appreciate that a lot. And if you keep chatting with us, I'm just going to turn on your mic so you can you can talk to us directly. I'm just kidding. Okay. Yeah.
Sorry, Kyle. There was another answer that I typed the answer before because someone was asking how NATO can support a relief, upkeep, operation, and disaster management at the same time, basically. So we have to be clear that indeed, as I said, NATO is an organization for security first, but also addresses disaster response. But there are different let's say, internal tools that are used. In NATO, we have the Operation Policy Committee that deals mainly with the NATO operations and missions. So the Kosovo mission, the Afghanistan mission, etc., all the missions. And they deal continuously with the back and forth with the field on the developing situation. While on disaster relief is more the Euro-Atlantic Disaster Response Coordination Center that monitors and manages the coordination of those activities. Of course, all the ambassadors are informed of both sides of the story, but just to to clarify that NATO can do both at the same time.
Thanks, Manlio. Okay, another question: what will change after Brexit? Being from the States, I have no idea. Manlio, what do you think, since you're closer to that?
Yeah, I'm close because my son is in London. Yeah. It will change with regard to the European Union, that's for sure, but not with NATO. UK is still part of NATO, so there is no change in terms of contributing to NATO operation and mission. But on the same time, if NATO is called to intervene in disaster relief and work together with the European Union, UK will not step back because it's part of NATO, and so they will be involved anyway. So there is, but on the EU side, yes, indeed, there is a big change, but I will not comment on that.
Okay. All right. Maybe this is a good question for Dimitar. So how do the military and civil emergency response organizations coordinate their activities?
Yeah, thank you, Cal. And there is another question down. There seems like a lot of layers with potential for duplication or miscommunication. Who is coordinating the coordinators? I will answer to those two questions. I will say, for example, what do you think about OCHA, the United Nations Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Assistance? I think it's clear that this is the only organizations authorized have the power to authorize any kind of intervention, no matter it is about related to security or it's they have humanitarian aspects or disaster relief operation. It is about having the power of United Nations involved in that process, and it is always involved in that process.
Okay, thanks, Dimitar. Okay. Next question, and we're running a bit long here, so we'll just take one more question. So during the volcanic eruption, which stalled all international flights because of fallout of the volcanic eruption, can NATO coordination and facilitating response with the national agencies be briefly explained? So if I understand that correctly, with all the lack of transportation options because of the volcanic fallout, so how do we coordinate with the national agencies, I guess is a question, especially about in terms of delivering relief and aid. I mean, I could only speculate because I wasn't in NATO at that time, but I would just imagine that if there's no airport transportation or no air transportation options, and of course it's an issue of logistics and being able to move, resources, and simply in that means that NATO would turn to an alternative means such as ground or any other transport if you just don't have air capabilities. But that's just something that I would simply just kind of speculate on, since I haven't seen any information on that, unless Dimitar, you have any information about kind of NATO's activities during that period of time.
Not exactly. I don't have specific information. This is the only spread information all over the open sources.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So sorry we can't exactly answer your question, but I'm sure there's some research out there or something that might be able to help you out. So yeah, Manlio. Oh, Manlio's got a perspective. Indeed, yeah, please.
No, concerning the NATO, the volcanic eruption, indeed, we have to be clear here that concerning the control of the sky, there are civilian agencies like in Europe, the Eurocontrol, who deals with those aspects. And in the US, you have the FAA, you have different air agencies. And those are, in a sense, responsible for the coordination of the flights. And then you have the military flights, which is a different story. Now, if we talk about the flying operations during the volcanic eruption, as you mentioned, Kyle, indeed, NATO, if you cannot fly, you cannot fly, and you have to deal with alternative means. But on the civilian side, they were sending out warnings, forbidding aircraft to flights, and in that regard, if there is let's say, a civilian disruption, all the agencies are responsible to deal with it. In that case, NATO, but not as a security organization, but as a pool of governments, intergovernmental organization, can deal with it. But during that time, it was more a European Union, responsibility.
If I could add to that too, one of the things about the disruption, of course, was that this occurred in an area where we tend to channel air traffic through. It's, you know, you have designated routes, and that goes back to long-term regulations and all that sort of stuff. It's not as though you couldn't divert around those. Now, of course, that's a problem for commercial operations. And so typically you saw a lot of the commercial traffic shut down. But in the case of emergency, it's not as though you literally could not get any traffic, say, from North America to Europe. It would just simply be a question of having to divert, and of course, the resources and whatnot. And I think there's an added element, because there's another question that's been posted about the fact that it seems like this could lead to a lot of you know, overlapping, a lot of, you know, potential for confusion, redundancy of effort, that sort of thing. And that's certainly a potential reality. In fact, one of we've used an article in our course to talk about, there's a gentleman named Judge Glock who's written an article about US COVID response. And he's noted that one of the biggest challenges is not a lack of, you know, governing bodies and agencies and regulations. It's actually that you have too many, that there's so much layered over it, is creating confusion and conflict. So yes, certainly to that question, I would say, you could see where this would lead to a number of issues. In the case of volcanic eruption, you're dealing with national agencies, you're dealing with commercial carriers, you're dealing with so many things that certainly can complicate things. So, and to go back to Manlio's point, that's why these conversations and consultations are so important. A lot of times they're having to sort out these conflicts to minimize that.
Thanks, Eric. Okay, just let's see, one more question, maybe Dimitar, coming back to you. So, and I think we've kind of covered it, so you could just answer briefly, but what are the modalities of coordination between NATO and the national civil protection departments?
Well, most of NATO member countries are harmonized their crisis response system with NATO crisis response system as well, and I think that actually answers the questions. Of course, there are some specific national specifics, but in any case, there is a clear established and developed mechanism to react and or to prevent such kind of crisis, and in terms of building resilience, societal resilience. Thank you.
Yeah, and if I may comment on this, there is also, we have to remind, but this will be explained much better by Dimitar during the course, because he's one of the briefers. We have in NATO the Civil Emergency Planning Committee, and those committee includes member representatives for all the NATO nations. And therefore, in that committee, you can coordinate all the efforts, go back to the capital, come back to NATO headquarters, and discuss among the member states and how is the way ahead, in a sense. So there is a coordination at NATO headquarters and back to the capital using those national representatives. There is another question, quick question, Kyle, if I may, about NATO and earthquakes in Bangladesh. But we have to be clear that NATO is not the police of the world, and there is a UN that deals with the overall disaster management on our planet. Now, if NATO is involved, if European Union is involved, that's another story. There is a need for coordination, but that's too long to explain now here. Okay.
It is a lot to explain. I would also add to that, actually. So we have to just keep in mind that there's essentially 4 tools that NATO has in answering this question about NATO being involved in preparedness actions. There's the political, there's the military, there's the economic and the civilian tools that NATO possesses in its portfolio that it can use across different domains. And in this regard, I think that you'll find that NATO ultimately, the responsibility for preparedness efforts, as well as prevention and mitigation or disaster risk reduction platforms, are ultimately a national responsibility. And you'll find that NATO may complement some of the national efforts through programs which are more economic and more civilian capabilities, such as NATO Science for Peace programs. Now you can go and you can just get on Google and look for NATO Science for Peace, and then you'll see that there is actually a number of projects, such as the NICS program that was done in the Balkans as far as a national incident coordination kind of system and incident management system. You'll see the NICS program that's done with MIT and the US bilateral program. And you'll see some others that are out there that involve more like research. So advanced research workshops that help to inform the host nation and the community about topics to be able to enhance preparedness and response and recovery efforts. But NATO getting directly involved into preparedness efforts at a national level and below national level is extremely, extremely rare and is likely just not going to happen because, again, the number one position at that time, or most of the time, is the fact that it's, all of these kind of national disaster management platforms are ultimately a national responsibility at the end of the day. And so that's something that you'll find throughout NATO as well. And so the last question, so how do you see a future cooperation between NATO and the OSCE? That's actually a really interesting question. So there's some committees. Again, we're talking about a lot of the same nations. So 30 nations in NATO and then 57 nations in OSCE, and many of them are in the same type of organization as well as in the EU. And I think if we just take a step back and look and see out the different kind of platforms and mechanisms and what the nations are doing, you'll see a lot of duplication that goes on there. What really changes between these different organizations is the tools they have available, the member states or the participating states of the organization that are in those organizations, and then the kind of policies of the depth to what they can go to. The OSCE is essentially historically a conference, a security conference. And so then you'll see that the depth of what the OSCE can do as a kind of regional security mechanism is quite limited in terms of, as far as what NATO has capability of doing, for example. But there are mechanisms for cooperation, and I can't remember the name of the committee right now, so you'll have to forgive me, but there is a committee on military security and things like that that OSCE holds. And so while there might not be a direct NATO-OSCE connection at times, there are certainly member states that are the same that are participating in these joint committees with the OSCE on talking about military security and other aspects. So I mean, that's about as best as I can give you an answer for right now as far as future cooperation. Because it's going to be, first of all, very, very political, given the different kind of nations that are involved in both organizations and the different perspectives between them. So, okay, we went a little bit long, so we actually went about 90 minutes on this today. So I wanted to say, again, thank you everybody very much for joining us today. It was really a good webinar, and we had a lot of response to that, and I really appreciate your showing up and staying with us for this long. If you do have any questions, feel free to let us know. Join the event and then be able to post chat and articles and things like that inside there. And we'll certainly be monitoring that every day as well. And of course, if you are interested in the NATO Crisis Management Disaster Response course, we'll send out the link to the University of California. You can take a look and sign up. So thanks a lot, everybody. Really do appreciate it, and see you next time.